Good evening. Welcome to the 201st meeting of the James McGill Society. McGill University is on land which long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous people whose footsteps have marked this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. Well, welcome to, again, this 201st meeting of the Society. Tonight, we're very, very fortunate because we have amongst us an author who took, I think, more than a historical, but also a family interest in the subject. And the subject is the former Dean of Arts, Cyrus J. MacMillan. And a book is available, a biography, treatment of his life and works, and you can see it to your right on that table. And should you wish to have it, should you wish to buy it and have it signed by the author, I'm sure she's willing to oblige. I'd like to move on and very quickly and get to the business at hand, so I'll simply say thank you for your continuing support for the Society. We come cheap. Officially, it's $25 a year. If you can see yourself to 50, there will be a great deal of dancing and many smiles in the boardroom. I'll leave it at that. I'd like to move on and just say, if you have any thoughts about hybrid meetings, because we are Zooming this one as well as having it here, please let us know, because we're trying to keep as many people interested in what we do as possible. We'd like to create more membership, of course, or enlarge the membership. And certainly in the past year or two, in part due to efforts by and connections by people like West Cross, we've had kind of an international audience. And international participants to some of the talks. So this is really, I think, groundbreaking for us, and it bodes well for the future. So again, if you have thoughts on it, please don't keep them to yourself. Share them with us. We'd be glad to give you an ear. Our membership secretary is here, Susan Button. I think she has some news to exchange, and Peter McNally, our executive secretary, will follow in her steps, and then after his report, introduce the speaker for this evening. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. I just want to repeat what Ron said. First of all, thank you very much for all the current members, because your support, especially during these last couple of challenging years, has been absolutely fantastic. And you know, it's a very difficult time, and your extra support really did help us with things like the web and the Zoom meetings, that we could keep going through tough times. So first of all, thank you very much. I'm very grateful for all your support in keeping the Society going. And secondly, I just wanted to say hello to, we have some ladies here who have never been before and are interested in becoming new members. And that also is very nice, and welcome aboard. We're delighted you're going to take an interest in the James McGill Society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Peter McNally. I'm the Executive Secretary of the James McGill Society, and usually I'm the one who gets up and talks about membership and money, but I think our President and Susan Button have done such a good job. I don't think there's really very much more for me to say about it, but again, to thank everybody for their ongoing support. And instead, I think what I would like to do is go immediately into introducing our speaker. And so this is Kathleen MacMillan, and you might ask, well, who is Kathleen MacMillan? And I have to tell you, when I first met her, I had absolutely no idea who she was whatsoever, but I now know who Kathleen is. She's a nurse who had a distinguished professional career before going into nursing education. She's a nursing educator, a PhD from the University of Toronto, and a distinguished academic career, culminating in becoming the director and professor of the School of Nursing at Dalhousie University in Halifax, a researcher of note on professional practice and also nursing history. And she has been recognized nationally and internationally by her alma mater, the University of Toronto, the Canadian Association of School Nurses, the American Academy of Nursing, the Canadian Academy of Nursing, and just this year she has received a remarkable acknowledgement of her career. She was awarded the Jean Mance Medal by the Canadian Nurses Association. So we're talking about somebody who has had both a professional and an academic career in the field of nursing, and so therefore, but I know that now. When I met her the first time, I can't say that's what I knew. What happened is I got a phone call one day from a lady asking me if she could meet with me to talk about Cyrus MacMillan, and did I know anything about him. And I have to tell you that aside from his name, I knew absolutely nothing about Cyrus MacMillan. But, you know, in my role as the university historian, director of the History of McGill Project, I regularly get phone calls from people, sometimes very senior, sometimes very junior, asking me if I know anything. And there's simply only one way of handling it, is to say, well, no, I don't, but I'd be happy to discuss it with you. So I invited Kathleen to the faculty club for lunch one day, and I discovered, first of all, she was a very charming lady, and I might add, still is, and that she was very interested in Cyrus MacMillan. I knew he had written McGill and its story, the university's 1821-1921, the university's first historian. But as I chatted with her, I began to realize that this was one of McGill's unsung heroes. And all of you will recall that as part of our bicentennial, we did have the Unsung Heroes project here at McGill. And and over lunch, I learned a number of interesting things about Kathleen. First of all, that Cyrus was from Prince Edward Island, and so was Kathleen. The other thing I learned is that she is distantly related to Cyrus MacMillan. They're, what would you say, cousins 12th removed or something of this sort? I mean, and there it was. And that also, that Kathleen, like Cyrus MacMillan, she comes from a very, very interesting background. They were both what would you say? They were descendants from Selkirk settlers from the Western Isles of Scotland. And there's a Wood Islands connection here as well. And so Kathleen, who had recently retired to Prince Edward Island, got involved with the Wood Islands Women's Institute, and which runs the Wood Islands Schoolhouse. And there she noticed on the wall an obituary of Cyrus MacMillan, and this really prompted her curiosity. And it just goes to show you never know where historical curiosity will come from. Anyway, I was fascinated. I knew she was working in the archives. I said, well, keep in touch and let me know what's going on. And I realized that these can be very frustrating and long drawn out projects, but here it is. It's just 4 years later, and we have a book which we are launching here tonight. I think that one of the things that has impressed me about the whole thing, I thought to myself, well, Cyrus MacMillan, what could one possibly know about him that would be different? And I think what we're going to find tonight is that Cyrus MacMillan was a very complex man. And I was asked by the publisher to do a review of it before its publication. And I thought to myself, how could you have a McGill Dean of Arts who would actually be worthy of a 400-page biography? And I think Kathleen assured me, she said, there are many more studies which are going to be possible about Cyrus MacMillan, and I'm sure she's quite right. So here we are. We're going to have a talk tonight about somebody who at one time was a major McGill figure. He largely forgotten. He is definitely an unsung hero, and I would therefore invite Dr. Kathleen MacMillan to come and speak to us this evening from sword to pen, the life and works of the Honourable Cyrus J. MacMillan.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Peter. And I do think back to that first phone call because it was the archives that actually suggested that I talk to you. And it really was one of these things that I thought, well, I found out that Cyrus MacMillan was a first cousin 4 times removed. We pay attention to that in the Scottish diaspora. And then I thought, well, it'd be interesting to do a little family, familial biography on him. But the more that I got into the man, the more interesting he got, and the bigger the project got. So it became a bit of an elephant. I could have gone down a number of different avenues. And what was very fortunate is that I had made the trip to the archives here at McGill early in 2019, and then the pandemic hit, and it was a perfect pandemic project. So I was able to spend my time working on this. There were avenues that I wasn't able to explore because some archives were closed and weren't accessible, but people were extremely helpful whenever they could be. And so I would suggest that if there's something about this man that you find intriguing, I would invite you to follow up on it, because I do think there is more to the story. Just going back here, this is a photograph that's in the McGill archives of Cyrus MacMillan, and it looks like it may be a graduate photograph, but I wasn't able to confirm that he completed a Master of Arts here. He did his undergraduate degree in English at McGill, but the only confirmation I had of his master's degree was from Harvard, and he completed his PhD at Harvard. But it's a great photograph of him. And this is Cyrus MacMillan around 1933 when he went into politics for the first time, and this gives you a picture of him as he's a little bit older. So I'd like to acknowledge a few people who have been very helpful to me. First, the unceded territories of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. And this is because most of the scholarly work in English literature that MacMillan did was collecting Indigenous mythology, and also stories and myths from other founding peoples of Canada, very much the French-Canadian peoples, and also myths and stories from sailors and other peoples. And of course, this is very controversial now because you get into the whole area of cultural appropriation. But I do feel that he treated these stories with great respect and gave the people in them enormous dignity as he told them. The McGill University Archives, extremely helpful. I'd like to acknowledge Peter, who answered my emails periodically when I was looking for something, and the Public Archives of Prince Edward Island. And the University of Prince Edward Island has this wonderful collection of scanned newspapers from Prince Edward Island that you can access, and they were an amazing source of informal information. My publisher, John Flood, who hoped to be here tonight, but he's joining us virtually, and so I'd like to say hello to John. And there's the website for Penumbra Press, if anyone wants to follow up with the book. Deirdre Kessler, who is a previous poet laureate in Prince Edward Island and an author of children's literature, who was a very, very kind editor, because this was not an area of scholarship that I had historically been involved in, and many, many others. So why did I get involved with this person? He's a PEI success story. He's one of the people who left PEI and became successful. He's part of the Scottish diaspora and the impact that that had on Canada. And of course, McGill was founded by people who had that background. He is considered to be a significant Canadian author, mostly in his time. And as Peter said, he's become somewhat obscure since then. He's controversial today in light of Indigenous reconciliation and cultural appropriation issues. So that is something that it is what it is. The man was a product of his time. He was a colonial man. And so it's something that we might want to discuss in the Q&As. He is still cited by English literature scholars in papers on mythology and folk stories, and was recognized as writing for children. His contributions to McGill University are significant. As an undergraduate student, he was very active in athletics. He was involved in student clubs, particularly the drama club. He was the student editor of The Outlook, and he had a lifelong commitment to McGill University as an alumnus. He served in World War I with the McGill soldiers that went from McGill to France, and he was with the Canadian Expeditionary Force with the McGill Artillery Batteries No. 6 and 7, and served at Vimy Ridge and at Hill 70. Those were two very significant battles for the Canadian soldiers in World War I. As a faculty member, he joined the faculty in 1911 and was a continuous faculty member until 1947. Had a significant literary output. He coached student dramatic activities. He probably is key to the development of the dramatic arts program at McGill and the theater at Moisey Hall, but he's not really recognized today for that. He was the author of the first history of McGill, as Peter mentioned. And as an academic administrator, he provided competent leadership in turbulent times. He actually was the Dean of Arts and Science before those two were divided. So he served as both, and in fact filled in as principal one summer when the principal went to the UK for an extended period of time. As a politician, I don't know what his value to McGill was, but he was supported to be a member of Parliament and part of cabinet during World War II in the Mackenzie King government. McGill provided him with an associate dean to help him with the administrative work. So there must have been some kind of value to the university at that time, but that's an area that I wasn't able to explore. Now, has anyone seen this painting? This is a portrait of Cyrus MacMillan that was gifted to McGill after he died by his wife. And there is a paper trail that it is here. It exists, but we have been unable to find it. So I'm just putting that out as something that if people might want to ask some questions about if anyone has seen the portrait of Cyrus MacMillan. I really wanted to have this for the front cover of the book, but it has not turned up. But we do have a photograph of it, and we have the paper trail. So, and the person who's in charge of McGill's art collection now assures me that it will be found. This is the interior of Cyrus MacMillan's cottage at Fortune in Prince Edward Island. And I put this photograph up because I wanted to draw your attention to the McGill items that are in the photograph. The pennant, the McGill crest is on the sideboard. McGill was a very important part of Cyrus's life and also of his wife, who was a McGill graduate from 1910. And the cottage is currently owned by someone who's a physician in the student health department here at McGill. And he was not able to come tonight because he's actually at the cottage in Prince Edward Island. So when I was engaging in the search process of this, I'm very thankful for the search capacity that is now available online. Initially, I found some sketchy information through Book Live's Men of Letters, which is on the web. The McGill University Archives has over 60 centimeters of material in the MacMillan phones, so there is a lot of information. And there's a website at Ryerson University, which has been renamed Toronto Metropolitan University, in the Canadian Children's Literature Archive. And there are a number of very interesting student papers on that website, also about Macmillan's writings. And his political career, I was able to access a lot of online resources. The University of Prince Edward Island Rare Books Collection has Macmillan's doctoral thesis from Harvard, and his thesis was on the folk songs of Canada, and it focused on French-Canadian folk songs as literature, as ballads, not for the music of them, but for the content. And it's 4 volumes. Parts of it are handwritten as well as typed. And it was a comparison of the folk songs as he collected them now and their origins back in France. And they were remarkably conservative. Even Sur le Pont d'Avignon still uses the Avignon Bridge. so that was interesting. They have copies of Macmillan's books in the UPI library, and they had McGill We Knew, which was a very interesting anthology of student remembrances of McGill. And actually, there is a really interesting little story in the McGill We Knew, where one student is reminiscing about taking Macmillan's course in English. He did the survey course in English, and it was taught in Moisey Hall because all students had to take it. Dean Macmillan, who had a fine sense of drama, would stride through the wine velvet curtains which masked the stage, wearing his black gown as if it were a toga. With scarcely a pause, would commence the lecture of the day, striding up and down the apron of the stage as he spoke. As the 1-hour lecture ended, precisely at the sound of the bell, he would stop, wrap himself in his gown, and without pausing or looking around, he would simply step back toward and disappear behind the curtains. The students always waited in anticipation to see if he would miss the opening, but he never did. And as I mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic gave me an opportunity to write, and I ran into a lot of very helpful people. When I started to think about how to write this story, one of the things that was evident about Macmillan is that he had a life that was in a lot of compartments. So his World War I experience as a soldier was one, his education was another, his writings, his literature, and his scholarly work was another, his career as a politician was another. And so rather than write a typical biography that's chronological, that starts with, he was born in 1878 in Wood Islands, I opened with World War I and his experience there because that shaped him and it shaped the rest of his life and the things that he cared about. Because as a politician in World War II, one of the things that he worked on was pensions for veterans, because he was very distressed by how World War I veterans were treated when they came back from the war. So if you happen to have a particular interest in one facet of Macmillan's life, you can just read that chapter, because it's almost like a series of essays about different aspects of him. The World War I service, as I said, was a life-changing experience for him, and it influenced his later political work on military veterans' compensations and the social safety net under William Lyon Mackenzie King. His education started, as you referred to, Peter, at the Wood Islands West one-room school in Prince Edward Island. His older sister was a teacher there briefly. He went to Prince of Wales College in Charlottetown between 1894 and 1897, where he got an honors diploma. And Prince of Wales College was a very scholarly liberal education college at the time, and a number of universities accepted the first two. If you did the first 3 years at Prince of Wales College, then you got advanced standing to the second year of a baccalaureate program. And so it boasts a lot of people who went to McGill and Cornell and Dalhousie to do advanced professional degrees. He did his Bachelor of Arts in English and History, graduated in 1900 from McGill, and his MA in English Language, Literature, and History in 1904, and that was not confirmed, but definitely Harvard University MA and PhD in English Literature in 1909. And he studied under George Lyman Kittredge, who was famous for his work on Shakespeare's plays, but he also had an interest in ballads and in mythology, and so he was certainly an appropriate supervisor. This is a photograph of Cyrus when he was in the undergraduate program, and it's from the university archives. And what I found interesting was that at some point, after he went to Harvard, he started parting his hair in the middle, which apparently was something they did at Harvard. His career at McGill, he completed his PhD in 1909 at Harvard, and then was a contract lecturer in the Department of English, and engaged as a lecturer full-time in the Department of English in 1911. He had leave for his service in World War I between 1916 and 1919, and was discharged at the rank of major. This is important because he realized that he was very fortunate, because when he came back to his position at McGill. And many other soldiers weren't so lucky. They lost a lot of seniority and lost jobs and really had to start all over again. He was promoted to associate professor in 1919 and appointed chair of the Department of English in 1923. I'm not sure what date he was promoted to full professor, but he was appointed Dean of Arts and Science and served as Dean between 1940 and 1947, which was, of course, during the war years, during World War II. And then he was acting principal during the summer absence of Cyril James in 1944 and retired in 1947. And the citation, when he retired, he was given an honorary Doctor of Laws, and the citation reads as follows. Mr. Vice Chancellor, this was Dean J.J. O'Neill who introduced him. Mr. Vice Chancellor, I have the honor and the great personal pleasure to present to you in order that you may confer on him the degree of Doctor of Laws honoris causa, the Honourable Cyrus MacMillan, who is presently retiring from the Molson Professorship of English Languages and Literature and from the Deanship of the Faculty of Arts and Science. Dean MacMillan has made outstanding contributions in the field of education, as a soldier, and as a politician. A graduate of this university and of Harvard, he has been associated with the Department of English since 1909 and has been largely responsible for the building up of Moisey Hall workshop and the promotion of dramatic studies at McGill. He showed great interest in Canadian folklore and is the author of Canadian Wonder Tales. He is the official historian of his alma mater, and as Dean, Dr. MacMillan has been a tower of strength to the university during one of the most difficult periods. During World War I, Dr. MacMillan commanded and took overseas the McGill Siege Battery, and his excellent services were officially acknowledged. As a member of Parliament for Queens, Prince Edward Island, Dr. MacMillan took an active part in politics. He was Secretary of the Royal Commission on Fisheries, and for a time Minister of Fisheries and member of the Privy Council. He was, during the later war, Parliamentary Assistant to the Minister for Air Defence, and his deep interest in Veterans Affairs contributed largely to the development of a program of rehabilitation of which we are all proud. McGill is glad to pay tribute to him today for his attainment and for his long and loyal service, and to do him the honor of conferring on him the degree of Doctor of Laws. So he did make a significant contribution to McGill. During the war years, one of the things, I don't know if Robert Small is here tonight, but his article on l'esprit de corps was really very influential in my expanding my research into MacMillan. And he told a vivid story of the preparation for the Battle of Vimy Ridge. The major, at this point, MacMillan was a captain, so he was the 2IC for this battery. And the major, the circumstances that they landed in were just awful. They were trying to set up the guns for the battle. They were basically in a swamp, and one gun sank into the mud, and they weren't able to retrieve it with 2 tractors. It was just lost. They had no material to build platforms for the guns. And so they were scrounging from farms around to try to get wood and cement and whatever they could get to build platforms, because if they didn't have a stable platform for the guns, they couldn't calibrate them, and they wouldn't be firing accurately. So in this mess, the major had a breakdown, essentially, and he went into his tent and didn't come out for 5 days, and MacMillan, as the 2IC and a novice officer, had to take over the preparations for the Battle of Vimy Ridge. So that really struck me, because MacMillan had this strong sense of duty that, you know, whatever you got handed, you had to just simply cope, and so he did. While he never got a medal for any kind of particular bravery during the war, he was recognized twice in dispatches for his contributions. And certainly McGill made an outsized contribution to World War I. It was the first technologically fought war, and they needed people who were well educated to be able to handle the munitions and the guns. It really was something that needed people who had a strong background in science and were well educated. And he enlisted in April 1916, and he was discharged at the rank of major, and his separation papers were dated in May 1919, and he never had to leave home to Canada during that time. This is a photograph from the McGill archives of Captain MacMillan in 1916 as he looked when he was heading off to France. And this is him with some of the officers that he served with. They are not named in the photograph. And then we get to Margaret. And Margaret was a very interesting person in her own right. Margaret Nielsen Brower and Cyrus MacMillan met at McGill, possibly when she was a student. She graduated in 1910, but he was teaching on a contract basis before that. But they didn't marry until just before he went overseas in 1916. And this was really a brilliant marriage. They were an incredible couple together. They were very simpatico, and there are preserved letters from him to her that really tell a much different story about him than you would get from other materials, because he was very open and frank with her, and would tell her really what he thought about things that he might be more circumspect about otherwise. So they're a very rich source. And she was from Pennsylvania, a descendant of Dutch immigrants, and graduated in 1910 with her BA. So there weren't very many women who had a university degree in 1910. So she was a very interesting person. They had a very shared interest in McGill. She was a graduate from Victoria College, and she volunteered at Victoria College after graduation. So she was here often for meetings and things. And they had a shared interest in literature and drama and religion and politics. She really was the perfect partner and a perfect faculty wife and a political spouse. They were rarely apart, but when they were, they corresponded. And so I found the letters were particularly interesting. And he always addressed her as my dear little girl, or my dear Margie. So I headed the chapter on Margaret with that phrase, my dear little girl. And this is a preserved photograph of Margaret around 1910 when she graduated from, as part of the Donaldas, as they were called, the students of the Royal Victoria College, because that was established through a generous gift by MacDonald, who was later Lord Strathcona. And this is Cyrus and Margaret at 484 Wood Avenue, which doesn't look anything like it would have looked at that time, because it's been extensively renovated, but this is them. And they never had any children. Don't know why that was, but they didn't. And he loved children. He wrote for children, so I have to assume that that was a disappointment. But they had this surrogate child, which was Lindy, the dog. And there's a fair bit of mention in letters about Lindy and what Lindy was up to. And interesting name. I'm not sure whether, because he was interested in air travel and planes and things, I wondered if it had to do with Charles Lindbergh. The other possibility is the Lindy Hop was a very popular dance at the time. But anyway. And as I said, his interest in children, his books were really suitable for all ages, but particularly targeted to children. And Canadian Wonder Tales, which came out in 1918, was marketed to children by the London publisher John Lane for Christmas of that year. And he completed reviewing the proofs, as he said in the foreword, between other duties at Vimy Ridge. So in between fighting the battles, he was looking at the proofs for his first book. Michael Vipond, in 2014, wrote a very interesting paper at Ryerson on the role of fairy tales in helping children cope with violence and war and bad things. And he used MacMillan as an example of this purpose for fairy tales for children. And there are descriptions in his war letters of children that he encountered. And he keeps talking about his rationale for serving in the war was to protect their future. His publications, this is a list. He was editor-in-chief of the McGill Outlook as a student. His PhD thesis, and numerous essays and stories, many based on folk tales derived from sailors, Acadians, Mi'kmaq peoples, and Scottish settlers. His first book was The Canadian Wonder Tales, and Canadian Fairy Tales was published in 1922, and then McGill and its story in 1921, and numerous essays and some preserved poetry, which he was less successful at, I would say. His ministerial activities and royal commissions. So very soon after he came back from World War I, he was involved with the Duncan Commission on Maritime Claims and the Atlantic Fisheries Commission, and he also chaired the PEI Royal Commission on Education in 1929. He was appointed the first Minister of Fisheries in 1930 by Mackenzie King, which was really a ploy to try to get him elected from Prince Edward Island and holding out the carrot that they would have a minister in cabinet. But that was a bad year for the Liberals. They really got wiped out, and MacMillan was not successfully elected. So he was Minister of Fisheries from about June till the end of August, early September, when the new government came in. And then he was elected again in 1939. He had a hiatus of almost 10 years there where his health was not very good. I'm not sure exactly what happened to him. But then he served in 1940 to 1945, and he was a Privy Council member. And from 1942 to 45, during World War II, he was the parliamentary assistant to the Minister of Defence for Air. And he was described as one of the fathers of the wartime Commonwealth air training plan for World War II. So, and if you know anything about government, the parliamentary assistants do all the work. they sit on all the committees and they support the minister by doing the behind-the-scenes work. And he also served and chaired on a number of important parliamentary committees, and all of this while he was holding a full-time academic appointment at McGill. So again, this is an area that I think is worth exploring more. What did McGill get for this? Because they certainly supported him. This is a really nice portrait from the Prince Edward Island Public Archives that would have been taken during his time, I believe, serving in between 40 and 45. Again, we're back to the Arden Cottage, and this is interesting. He loved drama, and he talked in his letters home during World War I. When he'd get a leave to London, he would go to the theatre. And he writes about spending time at the Russell Hotel on Bloomsbury, having coffee with some of the actors from the latest James Barrie play. And he really was a big fan of Peter Pan. He helped put on some plays, J.M. Barrie plays, while he was here that invited children into Moisey Theatre. And Arden Cottage was his cottage in Prince Edward Island. And it was previously owned by an actor from New York who also was in silent films of Shakespearean plays. His name was Charles Kent. And Arden Cottage is full of memorabilia related to Broadway and to Hollywood and film and theater. I was interested when I did get a tour of it that there's a set of fencing épées, and I was imagining Cyrus would be playing with those. And you can see on this wall here his university diploma from Harvard, which is a real parchment hanging on the wall, the photograph that I just showed you. And to the right of that is the picture of Churchill and FDR and William Lyon Mackenzie at the first Quebec conference. I have to assume that MacMillan was there because he was a member of Privy Council. He wasn't part of this photograph, but obviously he was preserving something that was important to him. And down below that is a signed and autographed photograph of William Lyon Mackenzie King. So this is sort of the political wall. And I will probably need to point out that the cottage is in the process of being renovated, and so some of the things that you see are kind of taped up because they weren't able to remove them from the wall. So it looks a little bit messy, but that's it. So his interest in drama and theater was really very much, I thought, a thread that tied together the various threads of his life that were kind of unique and compartmentalized. This was something that tied it all together. And as I mentioned, he was supervised by George Lyman Kittredge at Harvard, who was a Shakespeare scholar. But he also studied with Professor G.P. Baker. And George Pierce Baker was one of the leaders on stagecraft at Harvard. And MacMillan brought that back. Stagecraft was this interest in costumes and lighting and the sets and everything that added to the play. And he was mocked here at McGill because people thought that was technical and not academic. And so many times when you read, people were commenting on him, thinking he was George Pierce Baker, and he was just interested in the technical aspects of the stage. And he was certainly active in the drama club at McGill. And I have another little short reading from here that I think you'll find very interesting. And this was written by a student in the McGill You Knew anthology. So Moisey Hall Theatre has been in, nope, that's not the one I wanted. Which one was it? I'm going to have to pass because I didn't find it here. There's a description of him coaching one of the students who was in a play. And he said, no, Miss Renee, it's not like that. And he came up on the stage and acted out the part as it should be done, with a pile of oily rags supposed to be the baby. And apparently yelled and cried and did everything to the point where the students were sitting open-mouthed, just looking at this whole different view of Dean MacMillan. So he probably was a frustrated thespian himself as well. Anyway, And of course, the name of Arden Cottage, it is linked to Shakespeare because that was Shakespeare's mother's maiden name, and also the Arden Forest was a setting for a couple of Shakespearean plays. And so it obviously that was a really important piece to him. So the site is still there, and it, as I said, has a number of his collection of summer reading books and things like that. And this is what it looked like. It was a very simple place. It had no indoor plumbing, and it was where he went to get away from it all in the summer. And he went trout fishing, and he wrote, and went for walks. That was, and it's right on the ocean, so it's a nice location there. And there were a number of other actors that had summer cottages there and used to put on plays in the between the late 1890s and the 1930s. So I'm assuming that he was very much part of that social group. And here we have, within Arden Cottage, again, the sort of actor's corner. Charles Kent's paramour, it wasn't his wife, who lived with him at the cottage, was a Gibson girl. And so there's a picture of her as the Gibson girl there. And that's Charles Kent in the middle of the three on the other wall. Probably him as Cyrano de Bergerac. And I think that may be, I've only got a photograph of this, that may be a graduate portrait of Margaret. It may, but you can see that definitely the acting bug was there. His relationships with contemporary authors. Sir Andrew MacPhail, of course, is a famous graduate of McGill, and they didn't seem to like each other. I have evidence that they were in the same location many times. I don't think there was much positive regard. They had similar backgrounds. They were both pretty big egos, and probably the room couldn't accommodate both of them very comfortably at any one time. And MacMillan and Stephen Leacock were contemporaries. Stephen Leacock was, of course, a professor when MacMillan did his undergraduate here and then became a department head, and he was in the Department of Engineering. So they were colleagues at that time, and Stephen Leacock actually provided, he's acknowledged in the McGill and its story 1921 as having helped MacMillan with some background information. And MacMillan admired the poetry of John McCrae and the writing of Leacock, and also Lucy Maud Montgomery. He mentions those in an essay that he wrote on the beginnings of Canadian literature. And he apparently was never invited to MacPhail's literary salons that he had at Orwell PEI. MacPhail had a huge great room at his home in Orwell, and he invited all kinds of people to come and stay there, and they held salons in the great room. And there's no evidence that MacMillan was ever included in those. And he was never nominated or invited to join the Montreal Pen and Pencil Club. So I think some of that's probably because he collected Indigenous mythology, it had lower value to people. It maybe wasn't considered original work because he collected the stories and then wrote them in kind of the style of the fairy tale writers of the time, like the Brothers Grimm or Hans Christian Andersen. And I don't think he was a very easy person to get along with. When you read some of these things, he was pretty opinionated, and he could be difficult, I think, to get along with, and that might explain some of why he became obscure. He didn't have a lot of champions. And he's absent from Ian Ross Robertson's biography of MacPhail. There's no mention of MacMillan in that very extensive biography. History often rhymes, and one of the things that really struck me as I was working on this biography is how much of the time that MacMillan lived through is being echoed by many of the things that are happening in our world today. And so the influenza pandemic, for example, and we've had COVID-19, the Great Depression and some of the economic issues, the wide disparity in economics right now, and political unrest, which comes from economic disparity and pandemics. People get anxious. Nazism, Tariffs versus free trade. MacMillan was a free trader, so was Mackenzie King. Mackenzie King, of course, had his degree from, he graduated the same year from Harvard that MacMillan did with his PhD in economics. And he really, when I read these things and I read some of his commentary and writings about these things, it seemed like his thoughts are very contemporary. And he served in World War I and was in political office during World War II. He was a champion of democracy, the common man. That's very typical, I think, of some of the Scots diaspora. And the values of a liberal public education. He said if you didn't have a liberal public education, you couldn't turn out critical thinkers who could participate in democracy. Very interesting commentary on how important that was. And at the time when he went to Prince of Wales College in Charlottetown, it was a liberal college. It has since moved in with a UPEI, and now there is a typical community college there. I don't know what he would have thought about that. He was a passionate patriot, really expressed the value of a unified Canada, but always aware of the subtext of Quebec and the French-Canadian realities, and very sympathetic to the French-Canadian realities. And he was definitely a colonial product. He was silent on anti-Semitism. It's remarkable if you think about the plight of the Jews in Europe in World War II, the fact that that ship was turned away from Canada. And actually, it was Peter who brought to my attention that McGill, like many of the Canadian universities, had a quota on Jewish students during the 1930s and 40s. And I don't have anything specific about what he thought about that. I imagine if he had opinions, if he wanted to get elected, he probably thought it was wiser not to say anything. But Peter thought the fact that he was Dean of Arts and Science when the quotas were lifted might indicate that he had a different opinion about these things, but that would be a stretch. He certainly played a role in the founding of Canada's social safety net. He served on many of those committees. In his later years, as he retired, he was awarded the honorary degree in recognition of his contributions to McGill and the nation. He died at his cottage in Fortune, PEI. And Arden Cottage has all these links with an actors' colony that existed at the time. And his wife, Margaret, survived him by 2 decades. She briefly married again and was again widowed. And her second husband left a bequest in her name to McGill University for a scholarship fund. So there is a nice scholarship here in the name of Margaret MacMillan Pratt. His legacy, the foundations of a unique Canadian literature. Margaret Atwood talks about how the Indigenous contributions to a Canadian literature are what distinguishes it from American literature and British literature. And student enrichment, he was very involved in drama clubs and the theater at Moisey Hall. His royal commissions and his committee work, and one of the interesting things was that he chaired a committee that looked at a non-military system of awards for Canadians, which was the basis for the Order of Canada. The plan to go forward with that was approved unanimously by the House of Commons, but then actually didn't happen until about 2 or 3 decades later. So as Peter said, I think this is just a start. Many areas of his life deserve more in-depth study and analysis. I think it's a mechanism, the biography is a mechanism to reintroduce Canadians and McGill folks to a person and a life of consequence. And his observations and opinions about education and democracy are timely in the current geopolitical context. And the controversy over cultural appropriation of Indigenous mythology does remain an issue. And there's his monument in the cemetery just outside of Charlottetown. So he's buried with his wife and his older sister, Christina. And there's some selected references if people are interested in following up on him, but these will be also in the book. So I'm happy to invite some questions or comments from people, and if anyone's interested in doing more work in this area, I'd be happy to be contacted. So. Thank you.
Do you have any questions? If you do, you can either stand up and shout or go to the microphone. I'm sure somebody has a question. I actually do. In your research here, did you find anything about I'll give you my Rudy Valley voice. No singing? Okay. In your research in the archives here at McGill, did you find anything that was remotely critical about his being absent as dean?
Yes, there was a point at which when the principal was away, and I think that was during Cyril James's principalship, that there was a discussion that he would have to decide whether he was going to be a politician or a professor. There was the threat that he would have to make this decision. And Cyril James came back and that was resolved. And that was, I think, when Hatcher was appointed as his associate dean, and he was supported to continue. And there were articles in the McGill newspaper about people, that were trying to be both academics and politicians. So there was a fair bit of criticism about it. It would have been very difficult. I mean, if he hadn't had the wife he had, and Hatcher, I don't think he could have done it. He and Hatcher worked very well together. They liked each other. And it was through that support, I think, that he was able to navigate both.
Thank you. There's a question online from We have a question online. Okay.
Okay, how do I find out?
Go ahead, Robert.
Okay. Oh, Robert Small, hello.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I am here. Actually, it's not so much a question, it's more of an update to my first article. By the way, there's another one coming out in the Canadian Military Journal on the 7th McGill Battery. But it's more of an update on Cyrus MacMillan's observations of his commanding officer at Vimy, which was, as you know, was Major William Dunlop Tate, who was also a professor at McGill.
He was a psychology professor, wasn't he?
What's that?
He was a psychology professor.
Yes, he was, and he founded the psychology department here at McGill after the war. And it was definitely MacMillan's observations that Dunlop Tate in his diary and also in his letters to his brother, that he was just he just checked out and confined himself to his tent. And I definitely got the impression, as I wrote in the article, that it seemed like Tate was suffering from a breakdown. But since then, since I wrote that article, I have been able to access Tate's medical files. And it seems, at least according to his medical file, which was somewhat limited, that he was not suffering any mental health crisis, that it was more of an infection that was causing him considerable pain. The diagnosis was otitis, which maybe as a nurse you would know what that is.
Nope. No, I don't.
If you look it up, it's an infection that really hurts.
Okay.
So it seems like he was under considerable pain and for some reason was confining himself to his tent. But just definitely, as I the next publication that's going to be coming out on this on the 7th battery is going to mention that it was even though MacMillan and anyone reading MacMillan's material would kind of come to the conclusion that there's something really wrong with him mentally. It was more of he was in excruciating pain and for some reason didn't want to go to the doctor.
Okay. MacMillan never really said what he thought was wrong with him. He just said he was still in bed.
He was still in bed, but he also wrote to his brother, I think, that I can't figure out what's wrong with him. He won't talk to me about it.
Yeah, right.
He completely checked out at a very critical time, which the McGill battery was going through an awful time setting up in the last minute at Vimy. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your first article, which was very intriguing to me. So.
Yeah, I enjoyed writing it and I enjoyed researching it. It was great coming back to McGill. And doing the research.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
His sister play, Christine, who was she?
Who was Christina MacMillan? His older sister. She was the eldest child, and she was a teacher of some note. She did her teaching at the normal school before it joined Prince of Wales College in Charlottetown. She taught briefly in a rural school, and at the time when I was working on the biography, I didn't have confirmation that she had taught at the Wood Islands School, but apparently she did. And then she went to the West Kent School in Charlottetown, where she was there for 44 years as a teacher and was really highly regarded. Apparently, after she finished at the normal school for her demonstration project in order to be hired at West Kent, she had a bunch of primary pupils do readings from Shakespeare. So I think she probably had a big influence on him. She was 7 years older than he was. Yeah.
One of the interesting aspects of MacMillan was, of course, he was in the English department and chair of English during the 1920s when there was this remarkable literary movement that emerged at McGill. And I'm just wondering if you could just say a few words about how MacMillan interacted with the new wave of literary production that came with it.
Right. Well, there was some controversy there because he wrote in the Romantic style. He was very committed to that, and as a student with the Outlook, and as a student editor, and then as a faculty member, he really wanted to preserve the style of the Outlook. And there was another group of students who were very influenced by the Bloomsbury group in the UK, who wanted to bring in some more avant-garde styles of literature. So they actually started their own journal. And the name of it, I'm sorry, I'm having a senior's moment forgetting what the name of it was. And MacMillan was practically apoplectic about this because the new journal said they would publish anything that was grammatically correct. and it was Leon Edel who was actually very involved in that. And Leon Edel is a very interesting person on his own who was the biographer of Henry James and was a student at that time and very active in the new movement of a different style of literature. So I can imagine there were a lot of tensions around that time. But there really was an efflorescence of Canadian writing. He invited different authors to come in and lecture to his classes, for example. He wanted to expose the students to Canadian literature. And he wrote an essay about the beginnings of a uniquely Canadian style and talked about many of the authors of the time that were writing and were very influential, poets and people writing prose. Is that helpful? Yes. Yeah. Leon Edel and MacMillan really were at opposite poles. Mm-hmm. Any other comments or questions?
question for you about the private correspondence with his wife. He said he had unguarded moments with her, and he wrote about his real opinions. Did he say anything about the controversy he was involved in the Faculty of Arts as the dean, with the racial exclusion of Japanese Canadian students?
Yeah, I can't recall anything like that, but I mean, one really notable example is that MacMillan wrote all Sir Arthur Curry's speeches. So there's a file folder in the fonts of Curry's speeches. He was an admirer of Curry and wanted to protect him because Curry was criticized heavily after World War I for the mortality rates of the Canadian soldiers. And I think McGill gave him the opportunity to be principal and chancellor at McGill as a way of trying to enfold him from the controversy. But he only had a secondary school education himself, and so MacMillan was his ghostwriter. And the famous Armistice Day speech of 1933 that was published under Curry's name after his death was written by MacMillan, and the whole speech is in the phones in MacMillan's handwriting, word for word, as it was published in Maclean's under Curry's name. And at that time, MacMillan was very upset because there was an effort to write a pamphlet with a foreword in it that described the agonies that Curry went through to write the speech, which was really a pacifist speech. It was about the folly of war, and that he agonized over it for months while he was trying to write this. And MacMillan was very upset because he said most people at McGill knew that he wrote his speeches and that this would be actually opening Curry up to ridicule. And so there's a very indignant letter to his wife about this and how, I guess it was Lady Curry wanted a copy of Curry's notes for the speech, and MacMillan said, well, perhaps I should give her my copy. Yeah.
So was there any indication of his role at the federal government impinging on what he was doing at McGill, or you haven't looked at that yet, I guess?
I wasn't able to get into that. I think that's an area that would be very interesting. It was a very difficult time for universities during World War II. Enrollments were down because and students had enrolled in the war effort, and people weren't enrolling in university. And I'm sure McGill must have gotten something out of the fact that he was engaged. And MacMillan was connected with he had a lot of acquaintances, and he made a point of networking with people that could be of use to him. And so I would expect that, his relationship with Mackenzie King, for example, there's a lot of correspondence there. But that was very much one-way loyalty. Mackenzie King was such an interesting person in his own right. And
no seances together then? No?
No seances,
No.
no, and he doesn't mention anything like that about Mackenzie King, but he did believe that he was one of Canada's best prime ministers, and certainly ushered in the whole social safety net idea, at the same time that FDR was struggling with trying to bring that in the United States.
Well, there's a thesis by Tess Ellsworthy in the History Department in 2020 about racial exclusion of Japanese Canadians, 43 to 45. And Cyrus MacMillan is favored prominently in that as one of the key actors. Although
who knew?
It's because it's not in his phone.
It's not in his phone.
It's really in the papers of the Senate.
I didn't get into any of that.
Yeah.
I think there's a real role for somebody to get into the minutes of meetings here and papers from the Senate and other papers to really round out what he did at McGill.
Yeah.
I mean, this started out as a familial biography, and it kind of
it's growing. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your comment and your question. Yeah.
How long did it take the time from you began your research until the time the book got published?
Okay. Well, I had done a bit of work prior to coming to the archives here in May of 2019. because I had done some online research, and of course I wanted to read all of his books and look at his thesis and things like that. So, and I would say probably it would have been 2016 that I saw the little obituary in the schoolhouse and said to one of my other relatives, "Is he one of ours?" And she said, "Oh yes, he is." And so then I started just casually looking into it. And I would say that article in L'Esprit de Corps by Robert Small was when I thought there's more to this man than I initially thought. This is more than just a family story. And so if you started from 2016 to the book coming out now, that's it. But the pandemic isolation was a gift, because I couldn't do anything else but sit at the computer and write.
I have.
Okay.
In your research, did you find anything referring to Canon Scott, to Frank Scott, to Norman Bethune?
No, I didn't. But that doesn't mean it's not there. I really do not claim to have done an exhaustive work on this man. No. He certainly interacted with, where he was stationed was around Boulogne, and he interacted with the Canadian hospital that was staffed by McGill Faculty of Medicine and the Royal Vic and the Montreal General. He talks in there about social occasions going back and forth. So he certainly would have been talking to other people, but I didn't turn up anything like that.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And if you are interested in a copy of the book, I've handed out bookmarks, and they do have the website for Penumbra Press if you want to order directly from them. I do have copies here, and I can make change to if you want to buy one by cash. And John Flood, the publisher, is standing by on the phone if somebody wants to give him a credit card number. So anybody who is interested, I'll be happy to give you a copy, and I hope you enjoy reading it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, it's an honor and a pleasure to follow that with an invitation to a former dean to talk about a former dean who was the subject of your book. We're very happy tonight to have amongst us Dr. Carmen Miller, a much admired historian at McGill, and somebody who's been throughout his life, I would dare to say, very interested in Canadian military history and Canadian social history. Carmen?
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. When I first read the title, From Sword to Pen, I thought, what other dean can I remember who was in World War I and also served as a dean? And the only one I could think of was a person called Connors at Acadia University, who was Collins, rather, who was at Acadia University and he was Dean of Music. And he was fought in World War I, and someone once asked him what experience from the war he was able to bring that was useful to him in being dean. Well, he said, I was in World War I was in the supply and transport unit, and he said, I think the most useful lesson I learned there that I could carry over into the deanship, I learned how to herd mules. And I guess as a former dean, I can appreciate that too. But others who have introduced the speaker mentioned how little they knew, and I'm going to go on that line too. I have been interested in Cyrus MacMillan because I knew he was Dean of Arts and Science, and above all, I knew he was a maritimer. And I always believed that there's an untold story of McGill about the influence of maritimers on McGill. And I remember in doing a bit of research on the medical faculty for a person who was there, who was a maritimer, and I looked at the records of how many students studied medicine in 1898, and there were 402 students, 94 of whom came from the Maritimes. And of course, I could go on about people at McGill who's, as academics and benefactors who have shaped McGill. There's a real story there. So I was interested in Cyrus MacMillan, and I was aware of his political career. And I think in the summers in Nova Scotia, my wife used to read the Tales from the Woodland to our children, so we were familiar with him, but I still didn't know very much about him. And why I'm telling this or making this confession about my own ignorance about Cyrus MacMillan, I was nevertheless very, very interested in him. I also remember someone pointing to his house in Westmount. It was a very elegant-looking house. It didn't seem to match the salaries of most deans of arts. But our speaker tonight, I think, has done an absolutely masterful job in giving us an overview in depth and in a general sense of this very significant figure who clearly brought more to the war and to the university than Dean Collins did at Acadia. And I very much enjoyed your discussion of MacMillan, and it was very masterful because you gave us an overview and you gave us detail, and he's come alive, and we're now very interested in pursuing other aspects of his very significant role. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carmen. And Kathleen, many, many thanks. That was fascinating. That's great stuff. And as you were going through it, there are, I think, all kinds of links that other people, given time, will explore. And you've brought history to life. Thank you. And you brought, the injection of McGill with this pan-Canadian aura about this gentleman is absolutely wonderful. This is what the James McGill Society is hoping to foment and hoping that we can interest in people. Thank you very much. Basically, in order to wrap this up quickly, I'll just get on with it and say that on Monday, it's a Tuesday, April the 11th, that's the day following Easter Monday, we're going to have a speaker who's been with us before, Tim Cook, a historian with the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, and he'll be talking about McGill's medical contribution to saving lives in the Great War. I think it'll be a real treat to hear Tim. I know he's excited about coming, so that'll be great. And like Kathleen, he'll be flogging a book or two in the corner. So bring your wallets, please. Thank you again for your support, and we'll see you in a few weeks on the evening of Tim Cook's presentation. Again, April the 11th. Thank you very much, and good evening.